Yeah, let's get started with the draft agreement on a comprehensive strategic partnership between Iran and Russia. What do we know about this agreement?
We know that it has many components, which is reasonable to understand given the word comprehensive. It has a very big economic and logistical component. We know that Iran is situated in a critical space for north-south logistics with respect to energy supplies, with respect to general freight. So that's a part of it. We know that the Russians are investing in energy development and hydrocarbons development in Iran, that they have placed investments there, and that there's discussion of offsets, that is, Russia supplying, say, gas to parts of Iran that otherwise are not served, and in response, Iran exporting gas from where it has gas in the south, and to meet Russian and other customers. That is one aspect of it. The supply through Iran of materials to India, hastening and shortening the supply routes, that's also, of course, a factor. But let's be honest, the core element is, of course, defense. And the Russians have been in very intense negotiations with Iran from before the start of their special military operation. We know from U.S. accusations against Iran shortly after the start in February 2022 that Iran was supplying Russia with drones and probably with technology to assemble or manufacture drones in a plant in Russia. So drones were a subject which is quite logical because Russia had no big experience with drones, and as we very quickly learned, this war became a war of artillery and drones. I mean, the war with Ukraine. So Iran was fulfilling a very important need for Russia from very early in this special military operation. That there would be some quid pro quo, that there would be discussion, negotiations over what Russia could supply to Iran is entirely logical, and you don't have to guess too hard. One of the major achievements of the Russian military manufacturing was world-beating air defense systems. The S-400 being the latest widely manufactured and sent to the field, the most advanced system that Russia is using for its own needs and is preparing for export. It is reasonable to assume that S-400s have been supplied already to Iran in anticipation of the showdown with Israel that seems to be imminent. What other military supplies could be in store? Well, I don't have an inventory of that, but Russia has a lot of material that has proven itself very well on the battlefield and could be of considerable use to Iran. So these are elements that surely find themselves in paragraphs in the draft comprehensive agreement between Iran and Russia.
And when it comes to the conflict, to this attack on Kursk bridge, on the Kursk region, yeah, and it seems that there are rumors that are talking about that one of the reasons that the West decided to go along with this plan of attacking on this region was because of Shoigu's visit to Iran, and they wanted to respond to Russia in some way. Or how do you find it? Is that going to be, was that a reason for that? Or the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine was so desperate, that's why they went after this type of attack?
Well, you're right to speak about conjecture. You're right, because in point of fact, no one knows what the priorities were in the decision making in Kiev to undertake this attack, this grand adventure. We read maybe in mainstream as well, various interpretations. So nobody knows for sure. We also know what is not being we can imagine what is not being said from the United States for its own very specific reasons that we can identify as we go further in this chat. The one you introduced an explanation which is novel to me, but your first point. The second point, though, is widely held that the situation is dire on the front as it developed in the Donbass, that the Russians have been advancing, a kilometer here, a kilometer there, along the whole extent of their line of confrontation with the Ukrainian forces in Donbass. And they have been on the edge of taking a whole series of towns, which 6 months ago, mainstream would have said were just points on the map that have no particular value. But today, more seriously, looking at the situation, they are acknowledging that these towns that are now being fought over in Donetsk, in Lugansk, have strategic value, great strategic value, because they are a nexus of transport logistics supplying Ukrainian forces along the front, or because they are high points of elevation that would be of great use should the Russians proceed from day by day to a strategic move, a massive attack on the Ukrainian main forces. That is under discussion. It is realistic. It is acknowledged by Western mainstream analysts, as well as by the alternative media, such as ourselves. There are other talks. Mr. Putin mentioned them in his latest speech, saying that Kiev is looking to grab land to be used in peace negotiations, whereby they would exchange territory and come out neutral. They would recoup some of their important territorial losses by offering to exchange what they have just now rapidly seized from the Russian Federation territory in the oblast of Kursk, and possibly also as it progresses in Belgrade. So these are two explanations. They have been embedded in overarching coverage in the West, which is appropriate given that all through the war, Ukraine has been fighting a public relations war more than a military war. It has been engaged in public relations, trying to seize front page inches on mainstream reporting in the West, on television time in the West, because only if it is in everyone's face is Ukraine going to receive the massive financial and military aid that it needs to survive from week to week. So they have been desperate to get coverage. They've gotten it. They've gotten a lot of coverage. However, when you look deeply at what they're saying in the West, you understand that this is a vast gamble that Mr. Zelensky and his associates have undertaken. Behind the words of congratulations and look at what they've done and fantastic guys, beyond that, when you go down to paragraph 2 or paragraph 3, you find that these commentators in the Financial Times or in the New York Times are saying that it's a vast gamble. And as someone on the BBC said, sotto voce, if they cannot hold the territory, and if they're pushed out, the results for Ukraine could be, I quote, catastrophic. That is acknowledged within Western coverage. It's not something that's being said by my peers in the alternative media. I call attention and I read to what is going on in Western media because it stands in big contrast to what is happening in Russian media. The point that I'm making is that the Russians have been very quiet about their military plans or activities to push out or to annihilate the expeditionary force that Ukraine has sent into Kursk province. There is a lot of television coverage of the ongoing confrontation, the ongoing fighting, but I'm not speaking now about Vesti, the lead news program, or on such very authoritative talk shows as The Great Game, that is hosted by Vyacheslav Nikonov and a couple of his colleagues. They have coverage, but their military coverage, for the most part, is what's going on the front line, where they can happily report about a dozen key villages that are under attack and are either partially or about to be completely taken by Russian forces, opening the pathway to the center and west of Donetsk Oblast, for which the target cities would be Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. That these tactical successes are the first path to a strategic success that is still awaits us. However, when you come to what's going on in Kursk, Russian military coverage is nil. There is a great deal of coverage, except for one or two exceptional successes they've had. How many strikers and the American transport armored vehicles, how many of these they've blown up, how many tanks they've blown up. Yeah, they tell you that, and they show you a video image of the control images from reconnaissance drones showing the strikes by the kamikaze or hunter drones that the Russians are sending after to destroy the military hardware which Ukraine is using in the Kursk operation. That they show you. But where this is going on, territorially, who holds what? Absolutely nothing. Instead, Russian media are giving vast coverage to the relief efforts that are going on, much of it being handled by their emergency events ministry, MJS, and much of the material being not just government provided, but volunteer works. That is foodstuffs, clothing, and other necessities for the displaced persons being sent in by Russian citizens, by political parties, such as a Just Russia or the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. They are all sending large amounts of much needed food and other supplies to the displaced. The numbers of displaced, the latest figures, again, are given in Western media. Numbers are very hard to find in Russian media. The Western media are speaking now of 133,000 displaced persons in Kursk, and maybe 10,000 displaced persons in Belgorod, the adjacent oblast or province just to the south of Kursk, and both of them being borderlines oblasts with Ukraine. So the coverage is the human tragedy. However, whether this is a tragedy or something else should be discussed here. The numbers of Russians who have been killed or maimed, that is civilians, in this very big operation by Ukraine are negligible. 5, 10 people. Now, the latest numbers of Ukrainians who are actively fighting within Kursk Oblast are given at 10,000. We started out with 1,000, and in days 2, 3, 4, we were told by the Russian Ministry of Defense that first 300, then 600, then 900, then well over 1,000 had been killed. Well, obviously not of the original 1,000, but it's the one. They were the first ones. The elite troops were the first ones to take the losses, and then more ordinary Ukrainian troops being drawn down from the line of confrontation in Donbass. They were the subsequent personnel losses. That there are 10,000 Ukrainians within Kursk is nowhere to be found in Russian media. They have stopped giving numbers. They do not list the towns that have been taken. The Ukrainians speak of 1,000 square kilometers that they now hold. The Russians speak of half of that, but they don't spend much time talking about it. So the fog of war is being systematically kept in place by the Russian side. The Western reporting is saying that they expect the Russians to bring in a lot of heavy equipment and from the center of Russia, not to deplete their men and equipment on the line of confrontation in Donbass, where they continue day by day to advance and to accelerate their advances, which is understandable if the Ukrainians have taken away elite reserves from that area and have drawn down also some of these 10,000 troops that now are in Kursk from the line of confrontation. It is understandable that the Russians who stay there have an easier time pushing the Ukrainians back west and seizing more territory in Donetsk Oblast in particular. So that is the overall situation. But before I drop this question of distinction between Western and Russian reporting and what we know and don't know, I want to come to an issue that I've found to be very important in my work in general. I am asked fairly often by people who I may see, or if they've come to some public event in which I was participating, or more generally, people who write to me by emails or comments on my Substack platform. They're asking, what do I advise to get better information and to understand better what is going on in the Russia-Ukraine war than what they hear from the mainstream press that is available to them. And I make a point, just read attentively what is being published in the more authoritative media, print media in particular. You just use your own judgment and see if what these articles make sense, or if there isn't some internal contradiction in it, or if there isn't some nugget of information that is very helpful to understand who is who and what is what. Now, let me be specific. I'll turn now to one of these nuggets that was embedded in the Financial Times article of 2 days ago on the current state of affairs in the Kursk operation. They had gone, the Financial Times reporter had been interviewing several Ukrainian troops, Ukrainian soldiers, who had participated in the very first move into Kursk Oblast, that is crossing the border at the very start of this whole adventure. And they recorded and printed what they heard. Let me just cite the most outstanding piece of information. This was one Ukrainian soldier who said that, oh my goodness, we were worried when we were crossing the border, what would happen? And we were surprised. There was no one there to stop us. And we advanced and we went through into a forest area. And there we saw a group of Russian soldiers sitting and drinking coffee. And they were stunned and they were unarmed, and we shot them. Halt. They were unarmed and we shot them. This is on the page of the Financial Times describing a war crime. I said, there is a lot of propaganda and a lot of disinformation that is disseminated by major media following the press releases they get from the State Department and from equivalent offices in the European states. But not all the journalists or reporters enjoy being handmaidens to state propaganda. And some of them are true professionals, and they generally succeed in seeding their articles with information that tells you what you should know if you want to understand the contradictions with the editorial overview that people on the ground find and to the best of their ability report. And if you use your mind, you will find.
Yeah. One of the reasons that they're talking about this attack on the Kursk region, they're talking about that the Zelensky administration, together with NATO, they're planning to improve the position of Ukraine in order to have a better position if something happens in negotiations in the future. But at the end of the day, do you really think that this type of behavior would help Zelensky or Ukraine in the future?
Well, I'm an admirer of a military expert, a Swiss military expert, Jacques Bode, who from the very beginning was saying and is still saying that the NATO is not doing Ukraine any favors, that NATO's objectives are very selfish in nature and are to damage Russia to the extent possible, using as its hammer the Ukrainian forces. And what happens to that hammer, what damage it receives, is of little interest to them. So the notion that this operation is to help Ukraine in some way, I think, stands on false foundations. Everything that NATO is doing with Ukraine is cynical and destructive to the Ukrainian nation. The what the Russians are saying, to my mind, makes a lot more sense. The Russians are saying that this operation in Kursk was from the very beginning minutely outlined, planned, and overseen by the United States and its NATO officers. The denial by the United States that it had any role in this is only to prepare the way for getting rid of Zelensky when it fails. Oh no, we didn't have anything to do with this. This was Zelensky's own bright idea. That will be the story after there are 10,000 more Ukrainian casualties from the Kursk operation and from the gutting of what little they had left of well-trained troops on the 1,000-kilometer long line of confrontation. So the way is being prepared to get rid of Zelensky. The assumption is that this will fail. How tragically it fails, no one can say for certain. It depends really on what the Russians do. But it is entirely possible that the Ukrainians are being very cautious about their advances. We read in the latest issue of Financial Times is saying that the day's additional or incremental territory seized by Ukraine was only 40 square kilometers against the generally accepted 1,000 square kilometers that they've taken in the preceding 8 days. In other words, the advance is slowing down. And why would it slow down? One explanation is given as Russian resistance. I don't believe that is a decisive factor, because the Russians still haven't gotten into the saddle, as they like to say. And when they get into the saddle, then we'll know about it. It won't be that the Ukrainians go down to 40 square kilometers. It would mean that the Ukrainians are going into fast reverse, and they will have a rout. And the question is whether they will be caught out and surrounded and decimated, or whether they will find the way to make an orderly retreat. But virtually no one in the West, I'm speaking now about mainstream, when pressed on this issue, believes that Mr. Zelensky can hold on to this territory. That therefore, Mr. Putin's suggestion, I think, was not made with full openness or transparency. Maybe that was a nice explanation to his people, but certainly I doubt that's what he and his advisors believe to be true. Most everybody with military expertise knows that the Russians have vast equipment and men to bring in from central Russia and to crush this 10,000 man strong incursion when it suits them. So watch this space. Also the question of the evacuees. there's more to this story than just giving numbers or showing the how they're being how the evacuees are being administered to, given lodgings and whatever else. I believe that the Russians are preparing the way for a scorched earth. I believe that unlike their advances in to the west in Donbass, where there's a mixed population that has not left, was not under Russian control to get them out, because they're, after all, under Ukraine. And so there are civilians, and lots of them, who are left in the path of destruction that Russia would be making as it if it wanted to take a simple way of advancing quickly. In the case of Belgorod and more importantly Kursk, the territory is Russian. The evacuation is being ordered by the Russians, and that tells you something. It's telling you they're preparing the field for massive destruction. And why not? There's so much of the Donbass that has been leveled. So what's the difference if another 17 or 20 villages in Kursk are leveled as necessary to destroy the Ukrainian forces?
And on the political aspect of this conflict, and we look at the timeline of the conflict, so far we see every time Biden said we're not going to send tanks, cluster bombs. They've sent all of those, and right now just attacking Russia on its territory. This is huge. These are huge red lines being crossed by NATO and their policy. And what would what does it mean for Russia, in your opinion? Because this prune has been completely pruned during this conflict. Try to do everything to just manage the situation. But it seems so far his manner is just perceived by NATO that he's afraid of us. That's why he's not doing this, he's not doing that. And do you think that Russia is getting to the point that this we have to respond to them in a manner that they should understand what they're doing. They must understand this is so dangerous what they're doing right now, because attacking on Russian territory is something so different from what we've seen so far.
Yes, well, the argument you're making is a very good argument. And I think it's most, generally speaking, it has been most ably set out by Paul Craig Roberts, who has been saying for months, and maybe for more than a year, that Mr. Putin's gently approach and his extreme caution and to avoid escalation may have the contrary result to what he's motivated by. That is, instead of slowing things down, he may be speeding things up in the sense that, that just as you say, the West believes that the red lines are phony, that Russia is unable or unwilling to defend itself properly, and therefore we should continue on our path, because Russia will flinch first, Russia will take the first casualties, and Russia then can implode domestically, so we get what we want, which is regime change. This argument has a lot of sense to it, and I do not deny its viability. I don't think it's compelling, though. Mr. Putin, in so far, has achieved some very big successes. After all, who has 20% of Ukraine? Russia does, and it's getting more incrementally day by day. Put aside the thousand square kilometers that have been lost in the last 9 days. That can be reversed very quickly by massive Russian attack using these glide bombs, using all means at its disposal, and in extremis by tactical nuclear weapons. This discussion of using tactical nuclear weapons has come to the fore on Russian talk shows, where a year ago, when one political scientist, Sergei Karaganov, raised this question, he was censored, he was denounced by his peers. I don't know, that's in Russia. Of course, he was denounced in the West as being kind of wild man. In the June St. Petersburg Economic Forum, to everyone, including my own surprise, Karaganov was brought in as the presenter for the main days, the main event, um, the plenary session, and he confronted uh, President Putin directly on this very issue that you're raising. Wouldn't it be better to be far more aggressive? Wouldn't it be more prudent to be far more aggressive than Russia has been? At present time, Russia is holding the cards. It says, and everyone knows, that its stockpile of such weapons vastly exceeds anything in the West. And in extremis, Russia is telling everyone it's ready to use them. So I think that these loudmouths in the West who are saying, and they're in Germany, there are quite a few of these loudmouths in Germany. These are former uh, military officers who were serving Hitler, who have suddenly been dusted off and presented on German television, um, making some extravagant remarks about Kursk 1943, and leading the Russian media to say that neo-Nazism is not just revived in Ukraine; it's being revived within Germany. So these issues that you raise are very actual. They're very current, and they're very much discussed in Russian media among some very intelligent experts and political commentators and politicians. And but that is the level of discussion. Whether or not what exactly Mr. Putin will do in the coming days to snuff out this incursion, we will see. But I would like to again make the point: the more rabid Russophobic media, like CNN, they spoke glowingly about how Mr. Putin has been humiliated. Well, as we say in Old English, he who laughs last laughs best, and it's a bit early to speak of who's been humiliated.
Yeah. The other thing would be the way that the West is behaving toward Russia is just changing totally the policy of Russia when it comes to North Korea, when it comes to China, that we have huge developments in the terms of relationship between Russia and China, between Russia and Iran. Previously, before this conflict started in Ukraine, we saw that maybe the United States can some sort of managing this situation between Russia and these states. But right now, it seems that they're totally disconnected with that part of the world, and Russia is trying to manage everything. But at the end of the day, when it comes to these lines, these red lines that NATO is crossing one after another, it seems that they're thinking that maybe let's assume if Trump wins, if the United States decides to talk with Russia, they can be in a same position as they were before the conflict started. It doesn't seem that they understand that something that just is going on and on, just getting away from them. It seems that there seems to be that they can catch it right after when this conflict is over. Do you think that that's happening in the mind of the NATO and the people, the decision makers in NATO?
Well, decision makers in NATO are sitting in Washington. So there is in the United States a really serious degradation of thinking processes. and an intellectual quality of the people who are now occupying key positions. It's sad, but it's undeniable. You're asking about illogic, and there's Mr. Trump may be no genius, but in his latest discussion with Musk, this chat they had on X, he called this out, that it is utterly insane that the United States has achieved alignment between, complete alignment between Russia and China and Iran. This is a feat, a magnificent feat that is self-destructive for the United States. And yet, that is what they've done. As regards Mr. Trump, even if the Russian media bring out the point that I just made from the as they did on television yesterday, there is no particular liking for Mr. Trump, not at all. They point to that he's a braggart, that he's pretending that the United States has the power to knock heads together, to bring Russia and Ukraine together, and to force them to sign a peace that neither wants. This is not considered to be serious by the Russian side. So nobody in Moscow is cheering for Mr. Trump over Kamala Harris. Just as when Mr. Putin said that that he favored Biden over Trump, he was not joking. He was not being let's say
sarcastic.
yes, he was speaking his mind because they consider Trump, as they did in 2016. I was present. I heard this said by Mr. Solovyov when I was on his show, and we were in a coffee break, and I asked to put it to him the question, whom do you want? And he said, no way do we want Mr. Trump, because he's unpredictable. He's volatile. We want something. So we want to know whom we're dealing with and what to expect, and that remains the basic bias of Russian diplomacy and of Russian high politics. So yes, they throw a little bouquet to Trump for correctly identifying the stupidity of American foreign policy, but they don't want to be dealing with him.
It comes from his experience with a lot of presidents in the United States so far. He knows that Donald Trump, if he wins, is going to be a season for the policy. It's going to go away and just come back to the same kind of policies that the United States have been implementing all these years. And do you think that in China that they are perceiving the same way that Russia does right now?
Well, China is a law to itself. I don't pretend to be an expert on their policies. They are very cautious in their dealings with Russia. However, in the last final analysis, they must support Russia because they know they're next. It doesn't mean they're supporting Russia in every way. Yes, they're buying a lot of hydrocarbons. Yes, they are probably shipping a lot of prescribed microchips to Russia and other components needed for Russian military production. That's very likely. But in other matters where they're very exposed, for example, in banking and finance, they are, to the best of their ability, concealing or avoiding direct contradiction with American instructions. It was several major banks of China that were first forced to stop their relationship with Russian banks. And now the latest news, again reported by Financial Times, is that regional banks, and this is also in Russian social media, that regional Chinese banks who do not have an exposure to the United States are nonetheless also cutting ties with Russian banks and not putting through payments from Russia to Chinese suppliers. Now, this is, of course, of very great importance. So China is a mixed situation. It's not purely an ally of Russia, come what may. It chooses where it can to avoid so antagonizing the United States that it comes under severe sanctions itself.
Yeah. How did you find the Mahmoud Abbas visit to Russia, and what is the main policy of Russia right now? What they're trying to do with the conflict in Gaza?
They're trying to do nothing, actually. I listened to the reception, a few moments of the start of the talks between the Palestinian delegation and Putin. And Mr. Putin said almost nothing. They were commonplace generalities. He was speaking about the support that Russia has always given to the PLO and so forth. There was nothing in the public discussion that would indicate Russia giving material support to Gaza. However, there is reason to believe, and we've spoken about this in past weeks, that de facto Russia has been supplying its hypersonic missiles, its naval vessel killer missiles to the Houthis, that it has been supplying missiles and other equipment to Hezbollah, and so indirectly providing military support to the fight against Israel that would, if it takes effect, if it works, will stop Israel dead in its tracks on its genocidal path. Russia, at the particular moment, with this whole Kursk operation taking full attention of the Kremlin, it's in no position to give the Palestinians more direct assistance, or to get itself embroiled directly in the conflict without utter absolute necessity. For example, if Israel stages a preventive attack or any other kind of attack on Iran, then Russia will have to enter this. But we are nowhere near that point.
Yeah. Just to wrap up this session, as always, I like to talk about Europe because I know you're living in Europe and they're not doing anything substantially to the conflict, any of these conflicts. But at the end of the day, I think Europe matters a lot because it's so important, Europe. And we saw that right after this attack on Kursk region, the German publication Bill was talking about the German tanks on Russian soil. How, in your opinion, these people who are in this type of line of thinking, are they really thinking of the for better for a better future for Germany, for example, or they're just trying to satisfy the rhetoric in Washington?
Well, it's a complex question. The answer is complex as well. As I've said in the past, Europe has its own neocons. It hasn't been dependent entirely on scripts being handed to it by Washington. There have been for close to 20 years a number of outspoken, very anti-Russian people. The former Prime Minister of Sweden was among them. Of course, we know the Baltic states all are rabid. Poland has been rabid, whether it's under the preceding administration, under the present Civic Forum administration of Mr. Tusk. They are rabidly anti-Russian. The Europe as a whole has fallen under German sway. What we hear and read in Germany is of greatest importance because the other partner in a tandem that made the European Union, France, has become politically neutered by its own ineptitude and by some assistance from the Americans, from the CIA, by installing a succession of incompetent and counterproductive people at the top as president. Mr. Hollande was probably the most stupid man that France has had as president for 100 years, and his taking power was entirely enabled by the United States' destruction of his most competent and shrewdest competitor, Strauss-Kahn. Mr. Macron was brought to power by the United States, surely helping to destroy Fillon, who was his major competitor in the center. That is, he was the foremost candidate for the presidency, who was destroyed in a corruption scandal that highlighted an activity that probably 90% of French parliamentarians engage in. These were acts of destruction, certainly engineered or facilitated by the United States. They put into France's leadership people who are incompetent and incapable of holding up the important foreign policy dossier that France had to balance out Germany's economic dossier in the leadership tandem, the locomotive of the European Union. So we are left with what is there in Germany. And in Germany, there's a very mixed stew there. Some rather healthy elements and some very sick elements. Unfortunately, as I said, whether it's Bild or whether it's the German television, the microphone has been given to some very unhealthy elements from Germany's Nazi past. The Russians are saying, before we were talking about neo-Nazism in Ukraine, and now we're talking about neo-Nazism in Germany. And they're not entirely wrong. Reminiscences of Kursk are too well held by the losing side, by the German officers who lost the war. And they take a certain malicious pleasure in seeing Kursk rise again and seeing German tanks in the battle in Kursk. This is all sick, and it's regrettable. But in the bigger picture, Europe has lost its way. Europe has no weight in international politics, and until Europe cures itself in terms of removing elites in the governing positions who are serving American interests by serving their own interests. That is, by ensuring that they have American backing for their next jobs in international organizations. They get invited to have hot dogs in the White House on July 4th. This special type of comprador class that rules in too many states in Europe, they all have the consequence of leaving Europe directionless at a time of considerable crisis.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Thank you for having me, Nima. Bye-bye.
Bye.